Welcome to episode 78 of the MMA Rundown podcast. This one's going to be a little bit shorter, at least on topics. We'll see how long each individual topic goes. But we've got a recap of UFC Fight Island 4. That was the card that was headlined by Holm versus Irene Aldana. A preview of the upcoming card, which will be UFC Fight Island 5, which will be headlined by Cory Sandhagen versus Marlon Moraes. We have some other results to cover. These are not MMA results, they're Jiu-Jitsu results, but they're still very high-level Jiu-Jitsu cards. So I wanted to bump this one up a little bit higher than I usually do. Usually Jiu-Jitsu is one of the last topics, but I figured this would be worth talking about a little bit earlier on. So we've got the Who's Number One recap, which was headlined by Gordon Ryan and Mateus Diniz, but there were a lot of other really good matches on that card. From there, a couple MMA topics that came up throughout the week. So we had Adesanya, who, after defeating Paulo Costa, is on a 2-week quarantine, so to speak, and given that he has a lot of time on his hands and he has his phone with him, he has decided to just troll pretty much everyone in sight, and John Jones took the bait, and so there's been a lot going on between those two, so I'll recap that and talk about where we're at with those two at the moment. And the last thing to talk about is going to be fairly significant news with the UFC Flyweight division. There was a title fight that was scheduled for UFC 255 with Cody Garbrandt in it. Garbrandt got injured. He's out. Alex Perez is in and will be taking the title fight against Deiveson Figueiredo, so I'll talk about that as well at the end. So back to the start, we have UFC Fight Island 4, headlined by Holm and Irene Aldana. This particular fight was not a very fun fight to watch at all. Holm was very dominant in it. Aldana, I guess she was 12-5 coming into it. It's 12-6 now. So you look at her and you see number 6 ranked in the division. You're like, okay, so she's probably gonna be a pretty good fighter. And man, she just did not look good at all in this fight. Not anywhere. Didn't look good on the feet. Didn't look good wrestling. Didn't look good on the ground. And as a result, Holm was able to win fairly easily here. On the feet, Holm is known to be a very good counter striker. Not the easiest person to track down and land shots on. With that being said, you can't just follow her the entire time, not cut her off at all, and expect good results, and that's exactly what Irene Aldana was doing. I was constantly following her on the feet. Holm was generally waiting for the first shot so she could counter with some shots of her own, but Aldana didn't seem to want to throw the first shot, so there was a lot of weird exchanges there as well. But ultimately, Holm, though she was doing pretty well on the feet, also decided to attempt some takedowns and got on top as well. Once the fight got to the mat, just wasn't very high-level grappling from either of them. Aldana didn't really seem to be looking for anything offensively off of her back. Her guard retention wasn't very good. She was getting her guard passed a lot. For Holm, the guard passes, they were effective, but they weren't exactly the fanciest things you've ever seen. There were some moments where she could have potentially ended up in some much better positions than she did, but she seemed like she was a little bit more concerned about just staying on top than actually advancing to really dominant positions. So the groundwork really wasn't all that exciting. There was some arm strikes in there as well to stay busy, but it's not as though there was ever really a moment where it's like Holm was getting close to a finish, even though she was clearly the better fighter of the two. So as far as where they go from here, Holm is still ranked, I believe, number 2 in her division, so she's right up there. I don't see her beating Amanda Nunes. I'm not sure that fight's going to be put together right away. A fight that a lot of people are talking about is her getting a rematch against Germaine de Randamie, who also got a win on this card, and I'll get to that later. I guess at that point, that makes sense as far as Aldana goes. I guess you can put her up against any other girl who's like in that 6-10 range in the bantamweight division and see how that fight goes. But this just was not a very good looking fight for Irene Aldana at all, and it shows that she's still got a lot of work to do if she wants to get to the next level in her career. Co-main event. Surprisingly, this fight was given a co-main event spot, but we got Carlos Felipe versus Jorgen de Castro. Felipe was walking de Castro down for the most part. De Castro was landing a lot of really good leg kicks early on, but was sort of having difficulty finding openings for them later. Part of that was due to the fact that every time that he was starting to throw those leg kicks later on, Felipe would sort of like walk through and throw some heavy shots, and actually land a lot of heavy shots that De Castro was surprisingly able to take. But for the most part, this wasn't the most technical striking fight you'll see. This fight, on most good cards, is probably going to be one of the first cards in the prelims, but ends up being the co-main event. But either way, Felipe gets the win. I believe it's his first win in the UFC. Fight before that probably should have been the main event, if not co-main event at the very least, was between Germaine de Randamie and Juliana Pena. And de Randamie was definitely the better striker, as everyone expected. Was able to drop Juliana Pena in the first round. Pena did have some moments where she got some takedowns, but then from top, really, I guess I could have mentioned this with Holm too, but it just seems like for whatever reason there's a very high concentration of women's fighters in the UFC who just love to grunt incredibly obnoxiously and loudly every time they throw a strike, whether or not they're putting all that much effort into it, where it's even like required. But Pena was doing that with her ground and pound from top. It was making a lot of noise. It wasn't exactly making a lot of progress from top. Had some moments where she was in half guard and was landing some okay shots, but again, it was not as though she was getting super close to a finish. But first round ends, second round, goes for a takedown, is able to get top position again, doesn't do a whole lot from there. And then third round again, while going for a takedown, gets caught in a high elbow guillotine choke. And I guess one thing to note here is that, at least in terms of jiu-jitsu tournaments, you'll see plenty of people get choked and tap out, but generally when people get choked and they actually go to sleep, oftentimes it's because they're getting caught in some kind of choke where they think they're pretty much about to escape the choke, or they think that they're like in a really good position where it's like it's not worth tapping because you're close enough to passing a guard. And in this case, Juliana Pena was in a position where she was practically past Germaine de Randamie's guard, but she still had to worry about the choke. So for her, it seemed as though she was like, yeah, this choke's tight, but I'm in a good position here. I don't want to give up the position entirely just to escape the submission. And as a result, she ends up getting choked out. The defense was definitely there, though, because de Randamie didn't really have any control of Pena's body. Pena could have rolled to her left and then gotten her back on the mat and been able to escape there. But it's just one of those things where sometimes when you feel like you're so close to passing someone's guard, you decide that you're in a good position as it is. You don't want to give up the position to defend the submission. As a result, you end up getting submitted, and it's sort of like a wasted effort. And that's kind of what happened there with Juliana Pena, where the defense was there. I'm sure she knows the defense. It's just one of those things where it's like she probably felt like she was so close to passing the guard. She slips her head out. She's top of side control. But in thinking that way, she didn't give the choke enough credit, and as a result, gets choked out. So de Randamie gets the win. Now, that being said, because of the fact that de Randamie did get a win and got a win by submission, you have a lot of people online who are talking about, oh, wow, look at Germaine de Randamie. She's not just a striker anymore. She's improved her grappling so much. And early in the fight, there was really no reason to believe that her grappling was so much improved. In the fight against Amanda Nunes, there was no reason to believe that her grappling is so much improved over time. If you think about the amount of time that Germaine de Randamie has put in the sport, if she actually was like doing like 3 to 4 days a week of wrestling and jiu-jitsu the entire time, she'd be in a much better spot than she is right now. But that being said, she still was able to catch that guillotine choke. You had Pena, who didn't defend it quite properly because she thought that she was going to be able to get her head out and end up on top of side control, and as a result, de Randamie gets her first submission win of her career. So again, that fight with Holly Holm I think makes sense at this point. I don't really see either of them fighting for a title immediately, especially since both of them had recent losses to the champion Amanda Nunes. So putting them up against each other again would probably make some decent sense. As far as Pena goes, she probably just wants to get back out there and have another crack at it. But this was a fight that she was competitive in. She had some bad moments. She had some moments where she was at least winning for the time being while she was on top. But kind of a frustrating way to lose, especially when you feel like you're going to get out, you're going to end up top of side control and be able to dominate the rest of the round. And rather than that, you end up getting choked out, and that's that. The fight before that was Cameron Ells versus Kyler Phillips. Phillips was able to get a TKO early in the second round, finishing with elbows. We had Daquan Townsend versus Dusko Todorovic. Todorovic landed some really heavy shots on the feet. Townsend was able to eat him, but then was able to take Townsend down, mount him, land a bunch of ground and pound without Townsend being able to escape the position, and as a result, Todorovic gets the win. On the prelims, we had Carlos Condit finally getting a win after 5 straight losses. He gets a win over Court McGee, 30-27 on all 3 judges' scorecards. I actually wasn't so sure that the fight was going to be scored that way. Let me take a look at what the stats were. Condit was throwing a lot of volume. Yeah, so total strikes were actually 88-84. Condit over McGee, which makes sense. Condit was throwing a lot of volume, but he was missing a lot, and a lot of his shots were getting blocked. McGee was throwing less, but a lot of his shots were actually landing, especially with his right hand. I will say early on, Condit was not engaging a whole lot. And one of the things that I look for from fighters who are sort of older in their career and fighters who tend to be a little bit more gun-shy is how willing they are to exchange in boxing situations. It kind of goes without saying that if you're not willing to throw hands or get within boxing range, it's going to be very difficult to be successful on the feet. But that being said, a lot of older fighters or fighters who sort of lose confidence in their chin, they'll be okay if they're running strikes from a range, especially kicks. But once you start getting into boxing range, that's where they may only throw like 1 or 2 shots and then just try to get the heck out of there. And I kind of got that feeling that that's what Condit was doing early on, and that had me concerned about it. But he had a pretty hard shot from Court McGee early in the first, or like midway through the first round. And I think at that point he's like, okay, I can take this. I have some confidence in my chin now. And from that moment forward, he was a lot more willing to exchange. Was throwing quite a bit. At the end of the first round, actually did end up dropping Court McGee and breaking his nose. So for sure, I would give him that first round because he had that knockdown. And it was fairly close otherwise. But in the rounds after that, it was a lot of Condit throwing just these wild combinations, head up, hands down, which is sort of usual for him. But one of the things is that he throws from a lot of weird angles. So even though the openings are there for you to land on him, it's one of those things where it's like if you don't know where he's coming from, you might create an opening yourself and he'll be able to capitalize on it. And at times that was a problem for McGee, but I think McGee did a pretty good job of reading it and didn't take too many super heavy shots after that first round. But that being said, Condit was throwing a lot, was doing enough for the judges to give him the next 2 rounds, and he ended up winning a decision on all 3 judges' scorecards. In terms of whether or not I think Vintage Carlos Condit is back, I don't know about that. It wasn't the most impressive performance out of him that I've seen. It was nice that he was willing to exchange with the hands once he took the first shot from McGee, and he had some confidence there. It's nice that he has a win now, so even if he does lose his next fight, it'll be a 1-fight losing streak, even though it'd be 6 out of the last 7. But at least it would sound better to also just only be a 1-fight losing streak. So it keeps him around more. People are talking about the Nick Diaz fight. I guess that kind of makes sense. You don't want to give Nick Diaz the toughest opponent right now, and Condit isn't at the same level that he was back when he was fighting for championships, winning an interim championship, knocking down George St. Pierre, arguably beating Robbie Lawler when he was the champion. Like that version of Condit isn't what I saw last night. But my concern of him not being willing to throw hands and get in boxing range, thankfully after a couple minutes that was taken away, and at least Condit was willing to do that. But even still, he was throwing wild a lot, was getting caught a lot, and you kind of have to wonder moving forward if that's going to be an issue for him, depending on who he gets matched up against. But I don't really see him ever really breaking back into the top 15. If he does, it'd just be because of his name, and if he gets like a small win and some journalists sort of overrate him. But I just don't see him getting back to that level anymore, which is kind of unfortunate. But it was nice to see him come back and get a win finally. Fight before that, we had Charles Jourdain versus Josh Kulibao. This fight ended up being a draw. Kulibao had Jourdain hurt really badly early on, had him knocked down. Was looking for a guillotine choke, wasn't able to catch him, rather than sort of like releasing him and trying to go for a finish from there. He sort of like had a difficulty deciding whether he wanted to go for submission or knockout, and at that point it gave Jourdain enough time to recover. Jourdain had some good moments later on, including in the 3rd round, and as a result, fight ends up going to a draw. Fight before that was Jordan Williams versus Nasruddin Imamov. Imamov definitely looked like the better fighter here. Was having a lot of success in grappling exchanges. For the most part, was having pretty good success from the feet as well. So ends up getting the win here. We had Loma Lupuni versus Jinyu Frey. Mostly a striking fight. Loma was the better striker. Loma was able to take advantage of that and do pretty well there. Landed some really nice elbows as well. Had some good moments from the tie clinch. So that was enough for her to get the win. Very dominant performance from Casey Kenny over Alatong Lee. Just completely lit him up from the feet. I kind of figured we'd see a lot more grappling in this fight than we did see. But Kenny was finding all kinds of success on the feet, especially kicking to Alatong Lee's ribs. So just lit him up. One judge gave it 30-25, another 30-26, another 30-27. It's a pretty dominant win for Kenny, and I think he got a $50,000 bonus, if I'm not mistaken. I know for sure the guy in the first fight got a bonus, and that was Luigi Vendramini, getting a knockout over Jason Ayari. Had him hurt up against the fence, pretty much from boxing range. Was able to land a head kick right on the neck, clean on Ayari. Ayari looked like he was trying to grab the leg while he was hurt, and as he was like holding onto the leg and Vendramini was retracting his leg, he sort of just like got dragged to the ground by the leg, which is sort of odd. But then from there, Vendramini was just throwing wild punches and making sure that the ref felt the need to step in immediately. He did. I wouldn't say it was an early stoppage. Ayari was definitely hurt. Getting dragged to the ground while trying to like catch a kick is not a good sign at all. And then took a couple clean shots on the ground as well. So Vendramini gets the win here. So not exactly the strongest card, at least in terms of name value. Maybe in a couple of years this card ages well and some of these guys end up having decent careers. But at least at this moment, not a lot of big names on here aside from the 2 big women's fights on the top of the card. So that was what just happened. In terms of what's happening next week, we have the main event coming up between Marlon Moraes and Cory Sandhagen. Very excited about this one. Surprised that Sandhagen is the favorite in this fight. I guess Sandhagen is a very good striker, and the expectation would be that this fight is going to be on the feet for the most part. Moraes is a pretty good black belt on the ground. I don't know that I see him taking Sandhagen down or really using it that much unless he actually knocks Sandhagen down, which I guess is a possibility. But if this fight stays on the feet, Moraes very fast, very explosive, very dangerous. Sandhagen very technical and very good at finding openings on guys, especially as the fight goes on, and really starting to take a fight over as time goes on. He's able to start working his feints in more and start getting some reads in on his opponents. So we'll see if that's how this goes, if this just ends up being more of a technical striking match and Sandhagen's able to find his spots and stay out of danger early. But the first few minutes is definitely going to be dangerous for him against Marlon Moraes. Fight before that is another fun one. They got Edson Barboza versus Makwan Amirkhani. I don't see this fight going particularly well for Amirkhani. Amirkhani is pretty good at taking his opponents down and has some good chokes. but he also has gotten really tired in some recent fights, including the fight with Shane Burgos. So he's pretty much going to have to take Barboza down immediately and catch something on him. Barboza's not the easiest guy to take down. He has had some trouble in some recent fights against some guys who are fantastic at that. I mean, people will look back at that Khabib fight, but before the Khabib fight, everyone's like, oh my goodness, like, is Khabib actually going to be able to take Barboza down? And if not, what's going to happen? Khabib was able to take him down, and so he was successful there. But Barboza is not a guy who everyone who's fought has been able to take down and control. And if Amir Khani can't really set up his takedowns all that well, it's going to be trouble for him. So I think Barboza should definitely be a big favorite here. We've got Ben Rothwell versus Marston Tybura. I mean, I guess sort of like a low top 15 to top 20 ranked heavyweight fight there. Could be really good, could be really bad. If it goes 15 minutes, it's probably a really awful fight to watch, but we'll have to see how it goes. We got Marcus Perez versus Dricus Du Plessis. Don't know anything about Du Plessis other than he's from South Africa, apparently. So we'll see how that goes. Tom Aspinall, I believe, is a training partner of Darren Till. Has a decent amount of hype behind him. Had a pretty good knockout in his last fight. So a lot of people are going to want to watch and see how he looks in this fight against Alain Baudot, who I think is probably making his UFC debut, French heavyweight. Yusuf Zalal's looked really good in his last few fights. He'll be fighting Ilya Tapuria, who looks like that's a Spanish flag by his name. Then on the prelims, we've got Tom Breeze versus KB Bowler. I feel like I talked about this fight a little while back. Maybe it got pushed back onto this card. We got Chris Daukaus versus Rodrigo Nascimento. Impa Kasanagani versus Joaquin Buckley. Oh, that's an interesting fight. Buckley, I think, just fought against Kevin Holland. And then Impa had a really good performance on the Contender Series. Got a win right away, I believe, against Maki Pitolo. So a pretty good opportunity here against Buckley. We've got Ali Al-Kaisi versus Tony Kelly. Don't know much about these two. Giga Chikadze versus Omar Morales. This should be a pretty good fight. I believe it'll be a featherweight. Tracy Cortez versus Stephanie Egger. And Bruno Silva versus Tagir Ulanbekov. So again, for Fight Island cards, a lot of these guys are international fighters who we don't see a ton to begin with. So it's sort of tough for me to break these fights down if I don't actually know a whole lot about both fighters. So the next event to talk about was the Who's Number One event for Jiu-Jitsu. There was also a Who's Number One event that was done for Flow of Wrestling. For that Who's Number One event, it's basically like it's almost like a McDonald's All-American game, but for wrestling. So it's mostly just high schoolers. So with that being said, though there were some interesting matches there, it's not really something that feels super duper that I really feel is worth covering. But with the Who's Number One for grappling, they had the highest level guys, the best guys in the world. So in that case, I do feel perfectly fine covering that. So on the main card, the first match that they had was William Tackett versus Jason Rau. Tackett's a really good up-and-comer, now has his brown belt. Jason Rau apparently is like, from what it sounds like, he is like the ultimate guy where people talk about like sort of like the gym heroes, the guys who are just absolute killers in the gym, but for whatever reason just can't make it work for them in competition. Pretty much everyone who trains at Danaher's gym talks about how good Jason Rau is. I mean, if you listen to the UFC Unleashed podcast, you hear Matt Serra all the time talking about how great Jason Rau is and how he's like got him to train with and like how he's got like the highest level jiu-jitsu guys. Rau is competing against all the top level guys, but for whatever reason it just doesn't work for him in competition. Probably a mental thing. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but he had a match here with William Tackett. Tackett, a very, very good up-and-coming brown belt, a guy who a lot of people are looking at as a guy who potentially win the brown belt worlds whenever the IBJJF puts that tournament together. A guy who people think that once he gets to his black belt level is going to be one of those guys who's going to be hanging around for a while. So it's not as though William Tackett's a bad guy to lose to, but with that being said, relative to how a lot of people describe Rau, I think they expected more. But in this match, he ends up losing fairly quickly. It ends up being a Kimura, but it was from a triangle position. So Tackett was top of half guard and then sort of fell over into a triangle position, was attacking the triangle from there, then switched over to Kimura, was able to get the win. Match after that is a match that I did a step-by-step breakdown on, which was the Nicky Ryan versus Tony Ramos match. I've talked a lot about this over the last few weeks, just because it was a really interesting match to me. You had Nicky Ryan, who is Gordon Ryan's younger brother, ADCC trials winner, still a brown belt now, but at least in Nogi is one of the best guys in the world. Going up against Tony Ramos, who was a two-time world team member, 2014 NCAA champion wrestler for the University of Iowa, who for whatever reason wanted to challenge Nicky Ryan to a jiu-jitsu match. Flow Grappling made it happen, and this match went about as expected. Nicky Ryan immediately pulls guard, is able to get underneath Tony Ramos' hips, isolates a leg, and gets a heel hook in 22 seconds. So it was kind of nice to see that every so often they're doing these jiu-jitsu versus wrestling matches where they're making these rule sets that only make sense in that they make the matches more competitive, but they don't make sense in terms of like the matches actually mattering. Like you look at the Bo Nickel versus Gordon Ryan match where they didn't allow leg locks. It's one of those things where it's like, had Bo Nickel won that match, and it was tied pretty late, before Gordon Ryan was able to eventually catch that triangle. Like had Bo Nickel won that match after like getting caught in leg entanglements 3 different times, then does that mean that Bo Nickel can go around and say that he just beat Gordon Ryan in a jiu-jitsu match even though he was caught in 3 different leg entanglements and leg locks weren't allowed? Like, he really couldn't say that. So, like, having these modified rules, it can make the matches more interesting and more fun to watch. But with that being said, they don't necessarily mean that much to actually win them. It would mean a lot more if a wrestling guy came in under actual jiu-jitsu rules and won a jiu-jitsu match. And that's what Tony Ramos tried to do, but ultimately allowing leg locks for a guy like Ramos, who's a wrestler, just makes things a hell of a lot harder, and as a result, he ends up getting submitted pretty quickly. Match after that was Natalie Ribeiro versus Luisa Montero. Pretty competitive match both ways. Ribeiro won a split decision. Then Dante Leon, who was initially scheduled to fight against Gilbert Burns, which would have been really nice had we gotten to see Gilbert Burns here, given that he still doesn't have a set date for that match with Kamaru Usman. But I think for him, he just decided, look, I've got a title fight coming up. I don't want to put too much focus specifically in one area of the game. I want to be able to make my training focused all around Kamaru Usman, not around Dante Leon as well. And there's also potential for injury, so he decided to back out of this match about a week beforehand. So Cody Steele jumps in, and Dante Leon is able to get the win here over Cody Steele. Pretty dominant decision win for Dante. Then there was Gio Martinez versus Paul Meow. This one ends up going to a split decision for Gio Martinez. Sort of a tough one to tell. I guess when you watch the Meows enough, it's one of those things where it's like anytime they get caught in a joint lock, they never tap. So it's one of those things where there were some decent looking attempts that Martinez had, but if you understand the context of the Meows, it's almost like you don't give the submission attempt as much credit as maybe they deserve. So as a result, when it was over, it was like, this is a sub-only format. It probably favors Gio Martinez. It's tough to really argue who was closer on what. But 2 of the refs did give it to Gio Martinez, so he gets the win over Paul Meow, which is a really big name to have on his resume. Granted, I don't think Gio Martinez is ever going to beat Paul Meow under like a point system, like an IBJJF system, or maybe even an ADCC system, but under this specific scoring system, he was able to eke out a split decision win, and I'm sure Eddie Bravo is really happy about that. We also had a match between Elizabeth Clay and Gabby Garcia. Clay is a really good-looking up-and-comer, one of the better girls in that over 60 kilogram division. Currently a brown belt, probably should be a black belt. Was on a win streak of 4 straight wins over black belts, including, I believe, the current black belt world champion in Kendall Rusing, or at least the black belt no-gi world champion. So she had a chance to go at Gabby Garcia in this match, which is not the most exciting match. Clay wanted to play from bottom, Garcia wanted to play from top. Garcia got the better of those exchanges, which is a little too big. Even though she was creating openings for Elizabeth Clay to catch triangles, it's like Garcia was just too big to lock him up on. I was able to shrug him off. So for the most part, Clay was just trying to like go inch by inch there, but there just wasn't a whole lot of room for her to work with, and Garcia was able to use the southpaw pass a couple different times, get past Clay's guard. Clay would recover. Really weren't any super close submission attempts here, but you can definitely tell that Garcia was getting the better of the exchanges, and she ends up getting the win. In the co-main event, it was Craig Jones versus Roberto Jimenez. A really interesting style matchup in that you actually have someone in Jimenez who is willing to engage with Craig Jones a lot more than most are. He's been incredibly active this year, especially after jiu-jitsu tournaments came back after the initial COVID lockdowns. Has had some really big wins, including a win over Nick Rodriguez, who was the ADCC silver medalist at over 99 kilograms, but had this chance here against Craig Jones and got caught in a couple different leg entanglements, was able to get out the first 2 times, but the third time could not get out, and Craig Jones was able to lock in a heel hook and get the win over Jimenez. And then in the main event between Gordon Ryan and Mateus Diniz, you had a matchup between the under 99 kilogram champion in 2019 at ADCC and then the under 88 kilogram champion in Mateus Diniz. And early on, it kind of seemed like a typical Mateus Diniz match, especially since Gordon Ryan was willing to play guard, and that Diniz was sort of selectively deciding when he would sort of engage and not. Was staying out of trouble for the most part on the feet, but a lot of times was moving back. Whenever Mateus was on top, it's not as though it seemed like Gordon was really all that close to getting submitted or getting his guard passed. But whenever Gordon got on top, like you could tell Diniz was immediately in trouble. So one time while Diniz backed up, Gordon came up on a double leg, was able to take him down, nearly passed his half guard before Diniz was able to escape. then sort of more of the same. Gordon's on his back, sort of trying to wait for Diniz to come in and time some sort of attack. When Diniz wouldn't really pressure forward, Gordon would sort of like kick him away and then try to like pop up and wrestle off of his butt. Eventually was able to get back on top again. Got to mount, was able to hold mount for quite a while. Diniz was able to avoid submissions for the most part from mount, never really gave up his back, which is good because Gordon is incredibly good at attacking the back. So Diniz was a little bit safer just bottom mount and was able to avoid a few Kimura, Americana, and arm triangle attempts from there. But again, gets on top again. Gordon Ryan gets into a butterfly guard position, looks to go for his typical shoulder crunch Sumigaeshi sweep. Diniz defends, but in defending, created an opening for Gordon Ryan to get underneath, get into a leg entanglement. I believe it was an inside ashi, and then from there was able to catch a heel hook and get the win. So Gordon Ryan, not only is he just beating pretty much every elite guy that he gets matched up with, but he's also submitting them. And Mateus Diniz, I don't believe was ever submitted in Nogi at the black belt level prior to this match, and now has that first submission loss to Gordon Ryan. So for Gordon, I mean, at this point, people, if you're looking for someone to beat Gordon, like they're just asking for like older legends to come back and hope that they're still like at a level where they can beat Gordon. Andre Galvao is the match a lot of people want to see. Maybe at some point, it seems unlikely, but maybe Roger Gracie will come back for a match there. Marcelo Garcia is talking about returning again. I don't know if that's a match that's never going to happen, but people are really running low on high-level jiu-jitsu guys who they think have a shot at Gordon, who are going to be able to get a win there. Mateus Diniz was one of the guys that some people were looking at, given that he was one weight class away, that he just won ADCC, but he was just never close to submitting Gordon Ryan in this match. Gordon was giving him a lot more trouble, especially from top, and then eventually was able to catch that heel hook and get the win here. So that covers it for who's number one. Back to a couple UFC-related topics. There is the beef going on right now between Israel Adesanya and Jon Jones. So these two were just getting personal with each other on Twitter a lot. As far as the specifics of that, I don't know if it's really worth like trying to really read through all the tweets they've had back and forth. There was one of the things that Jon Jones likes to talk about, and it's a fair point, is that Israel is very specific about the date in which he wants to fight Jon Jones. It's 2021. And John's response is like, why is that the specific date that you want to fight me? Are you concerned that you're going to lose to me right now? Does your coach not believe in you? So Jones made a comment where it's like, does your dad at least believe in you? Because it seems like your coach doesn't. And Adesanya came back responding, making a comment about Jon Jones' mother, who is, of course, now deceased. Jones didn't really take too kindly to that. A lot of people felt like that was a little bit much for Israel Adesanya. Again, I'm not really concerned in litigating whether or not that trash talk's going too far. But it seems like between the two of them, they've just been constantly going back and forth at each other. And when asked about it, Dana White said that it makes sense right now to look between Jon Jones and Israel Adesanya for a match. Now, with that being said, Adesanya is a middleweight, just made 184 for his last fight. Jon Jones was a light heavyweight, is talking about moving up to heavyweight, just gave up his light heavyweight title. Whether or not that was so he can now focus on going up to heavyweight, like he said, or whether that's because he was just tired of all the politics, didn't really want to take the money that was being offered to him, and felt like he'd rather just give up the light heavyweight title and focus on heavyweight or do something else. That's hard to say. But if he actually is bulking up right now, to the point where making 205 is going to be a problem for him, I'm not sure what way they would plan to make a fight between Jon Jones and Israel Adesanya. Also, if they're going to do that, seems a little odd that they do it now that Jon Jones is not the champion anymore. Seems like it'd be a bigger fight if Jones's 205 championship was on the line. So are they just going to make it a catchweight fight just for the fun of it, where if Adesanya loses, who cares? He's still the middleweight champion. If Jones wins, or if Jones loses, nice with for Adesanya, maybe then he gets a shot at Blachowicz. I don't know what the plan would be for that. I don't know if the timing's quite right for it. But Dana White is talking about how that's a fight that makes sense right now. As far as fights that make sense for Adesanya, it seems that there's a pretty limited amount because a lot of the top guys are currently scheduled to fight other people. Darren Till's coming off of a loss. Whitaker's got a win, coming off a win. Cannonier's coming off of a few wins. Those two are fighting each other, so the winner there potentially could earn a title shot. But again, that fight's not going to happen for a little bit. And if Adesanya wants to fight before the end of the year, the winner there might not be healthy in time for that fight. There's also talk of Chris Weidman. Chris Weidman of 2014, I'd probably pick to win that fight. Chris Weidman of today, this is sort of like what I was talking about before with Carlos Condit, where one of the things you really watch for is willingness to exchange in boxing range, and Chris Weidman has had zero willingness to do that lately. That's caused a lot of problems for him. Thankfully, he was able to eke out a win against Akhmedov, but in his fights before that, just his unwillingness to engage in boxing, including the Dominic Reyes fight, where he was just like running at him, trying to tackle him the whole time. Like, it's going to be a problem for him, and because he's not willing to engage in the boxing, this could definitely make things a lot more difficult for him. When he beat Anderson Silva, it wasn't because he just like ran at Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva tackled him and then submitted him. Both times he actually beat him on the feet because he was actually willing to engage there. But I haven't seen that from Chris Weidman lately. Chris Weidman had suffered quite a few knockout losses since those Anderson Silva fights. So to think that he's going to put in place a similar game plan that what he did to Anderson Silva and be successful with it, I just don't see that in the modern version of him. So while the storyline's fun, I don't even know if he's ranked right now. If he is ranked, I don't think he's even in the top 10, so they're not going to put that fight together. Though, from a grappling standpoint, he definitely gives some issues to Israel Adesanya. He gives issues to a lot of guys, given that he's an All-American wrestler who's got an incredible top game, very good top pressure. Excellent at passing guard, excellent at getting to mount, and very heavy pressure for mount, to the point where he's oftentimes either going to finish around on top of mount or be able to actually get a finish from there, including when he was able to get on top of Kellen Gastelum and catch him in an arm triangle. So at least from a grappling standpoint, I understand the argument that he would be making there. I could see why he feels that there are positions where he can beat Israel Adesanya, but you got to be able to strike to get into those positions, and just his unwillingness to do anything within boxing range right now is going to be a huge problem for him, and Adesanya would probably pick him apart. But that, I guess, is a fight that's briefly been discussed because Chris Weidman's put his name in the hat, so at least credit to him for that. But outside of that, it's sort of have to tell what the UFC is going to want to do there. But Jones does not have a fight lined up right now, so if the UFC really wants to make a fight between Jones and Adesanya for the end of the year, maybe that's a fight they make. Again, that's something that they're talking about right now. I don't think they're talking about it like as if they're starting to like put contracts together and like send them to both fighters. But it'll be interesting to see if this actually goes anywhere. And then the last topic is the UFC Flyweight title. So after Deiveson Figueiredo was able to beat Joseph Benavidez, not once but twice. Obviously, he had to beat him twice because the first time he missed weight. The next title fight that was lined up for him was going to be against Cody Garbrandt, dropping down from 135. Garbrandt suffered a pretty severe injury. I believe it was a torn bicep. So as a result, he is no longer going to be able to make the fight on November, I believe it's 21st, but he won't be able to make the fight next month. So the UFC, rather than pushing the fight back and waiting for him to heal, they decided to have someone else step in and take that title fight. And that's going to be Alex Perez, so he'll now be fighting against Deiveson Figueiredo. This will make for a really interesting fight. We'll see if Perez is able to take this fight to the ground, or if he just tries to mix it up on the feet. But either way, it's going to be a really fun firefight with Figueiredo and Cody Garbrandt. I think with Perez and Figueiredo, it's still going to be a really fun fight to watch either way. Part of that's just because Figueiredo's a really fun guy to watch regardless of who he fights. So that's going to be a fight to look forward to. We'll see if Perez is able to take advantage of the shot and actually earn himself a UFC title. But if he does, might be one of the least known UFC champions on the... Well, actually, come to think of it, probably... Figueiredo might be the least known UFC champion right now if you think about it. All the guys, all the men 135 and up are pretty well known. I guess Peter Yan isn't the most well known. He's fairly new to the scene. But from there, what else do we got? We got Volkanovski. I think he's fairly well known by now. Everyone knows who Khabib is. Huge star. Kamaru Usman's been in some pretty big fights, so he's well known. Both with Covington and then Jorge Masvidal. Adesanya is well known. I guess Blachowicz, he's been around long enough that enough people are familiar with him, but he's not exactly the biggest name. And then Stipe Miocic is pretty well known. On the women's side, what do we got? 115, I believe it is... No, that's 125. 115. Who is the 115 champion? Let's go down from 145 Nunes, everyone knows. 135 Nunes, everyone knows. 125 is Shevchenko, and it was Zhang Weili who was the 115 champion. I was mixing up weight classes. Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely possible that the winner of Figueiredo versus Alex Perez, even if it's Figueiredo, who has been able to build a little bit of a name for himself this year, might be the least known UFC champion, but still, UFC title's a UFC title, and the flyweight class is a very fun weight class to watch. So that covers it for this week. Next week we'll be recapping the Moraes versus Sandhagen card and previewing the card that's coming up the week after that. And hopefully there's a little bit more to talk about than there was this week. This week all we really had to talk about was Twitter beef between Jones and Adesanya, and then also a flyweight title fight that was getting shifted around. But I'm sure some stuff will happen. UFC is now in week 2 of a 5-week stretch in Fight Island, and I'm sure plenty of news is to come in terms of new fights being announced, fights getting shifted around, and more things like that.